COVID-19. As we face those challenges and we address those issues going forward, both managing risk and making sure that our workplaces and places of businesses are places that both employees can work effectively and customers can feel comfortable coming to buy our services and buy our goods, there are guidelines and steps we need to take in this new era to meet both of those objectives. And that's what we've prepared today. We've spent a lot of time analyzing various guidance from the federal and state governments. We have spent a lot of time analyzing different industry standards. And what we want to present to you today is steps that you should consider, a plan that you can put into place for reopening if you've been closed, or continuing business operations in this new paradigm that we're all dealing with. So the first presenter today is going to be Susan Machidor, who's going to talk about creating a plan for reopening. Then our next presenter is going to be Liz Mellon, who's going to talk about the relevant guidance that we have from federal and state bodies, including OSHA and the CDC, about distancing and about cleaning and disinfecting work areas. We're next going to hear from Mark Wagner about considerations that employers should take with regard to personal protective equipment, masks and other equipment that enables employees to feel safe and it creates barriers and separation between employees and customers. Next, we're going to hear from Christina Jepson, who's going to talk about temperature testing and inquiries of employees regarding exposure to COVID-19 before they can return to the workplace. Then we're going to hear from Amy Lombardo, who is going to talk about testing employees for COVID-19 and what employers should do if those tests come back positive. And then last, we're going to hear from Christina Jepson again, who's going to talk about how all these policies are going to work with vulnerable personnel. You look at the guidelines from both the state and the federal government, and they talk about, and the counties, and they talk about treating vulnerable personnel. And that creates a whole host of issues for employers with regard to ADA inquiries, and Christina is going to touch about some of those items. Then we're going to leave a few minutes at the end to talk about any questions that any of you might have. So please feel free to send questions. We're reserving time at the end to answer those questions. And we'll now turn the time over to Susan.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to talk about the plan that you should create to open your business. And this plan is both a planning tool to help you consider all the factors that are going to affect what your business is going to look like. And then it should really be a living document that you use to train, to operate by, and that is going to be in flux. Because right now, in the state of Utah, we go down to orange on Friday, and then after that, hopefully we're going to step down, and the way that you operate in your workplace may change, or it may not. So this isn't a static document. And I want to talk about, first of all, overarching considerations when you're creating this plan. One of the things that should be in your mind is that the tone from the top is really going to affect how your employees operate under this plan, how effective it is. If you have people at the top who, for example, don't want to wear masks, then your lower level employees may not want to wear masks. So there needs to be robust support and following of this plan from the top. The second thing you need to be thinking about is communication. And so how are you going to communicate this plan? And the frequency of communication, the type of communication, be it written, oral, team meetings, policies, how is it going to be disseminated, and then to whom you're going to disseminate it. So of course it's going to be employees and managers and supervisors, but then you also have customers, you have vendors. You'll be working with your landlord to determine what they're going to be doing. So there are other people and entities that you need to also consider communication with. The third thing is documentation. You should assign specific documentation tasks to a particular particular employee, so that it becomes part of their job duty, and that it doesn't get missed. Documentation will be really important for liability concerns. I think Amy will talk a little bit about contact tracing, and so there'll be documentation not for wage and hour issues, but who's on the job and those types of things. You want to know like when and how decisions were made. For example, how did you decide to bring back certain employees? There'll be confidentiality concerns if you elect to do testing, that you'll need to go ahead and set up files that are separate from employee files, that sort of thing. And then records of attendance, as I said, that won't be used for wage and hour concerns, and that will have a different purpose for opening. The next slide. The fourth thing you want to guide you in creating the plan and moving forward in the future is regular checking the guidance. There's a lot of guidance at a federal level, CDC, OSHA, EEOC, there's MSHA guidance, all sorts of guidance. There's state, county, city orders, health department guidance, and then you have industry and trade guidance. And all of those offer valuable tips essentially and guidance as to how you're going to operate. And finally, you want to make sure before you launch that you have all of your policies in place and that you've reviewed your existing policies to see how does this change. So you'll want new leave policies to comply with the coronavirus, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Review your existing sick policies. Do you require notes? That sort of thing. Is that going to change? Emergency plans. Do you need to review those and have additional protocol for notifying employees and vendors and customers of a positive COVID-19 test? And you also, first thing you need to address, one of the big things is your physical space. And the physical space in a lot of ways is going to dictate how you bring people back and how you plan to walk through your workspace and how you have customers walk through your workspace on a day-to-day basis. So I suggest physically walking through your workspace from the parking lot, coming in and moving through your office. And you want to be looking at cleaning and spacing concerns. So where are people congregating? You want to talk to your landlord, for example. How many people are going to be allowed in the elevator? If you're on a higher floor, you want to make plans to stagger your employees, for example, so that not everyone is getting there at 8 in the morning and standing together, 3 feet apart from each other. You want to find out how often the landlord is cleaning those surfaces to make sure that that's compliant. And then do you come up the elevator or in the front doors? What do you hit then? Look at your work areas to see how close people are spaced. You can also look at your office spacing. And if you need to move people further, go ahead and do that before you open so that they have physical distance between them. And then consider when you're thinking about who to bring back first, would it make sense to stagger people physically and that sort of thing? If you have multiple floors, can you have different people on different floors there? Are you going to bring people back by work teams? Are those close to each other? How does that look? You want to identify high traffic areas and what you're going to do about them. So the secretary's desk, copiers, the kitchen, are you going to have rules for those spaces? Are you going to have one-person rules? Are you going to require people to wipe down after they're done? That sort of thing. And next slide. And then come up with solutions for addressing issues, barriers where there's unavoidable contact. One person at a time, maybe have one-way aisles like most grocery stores are doing. Have one person assigned to a specific task. So one person goes in and gets all the supplies out of the room, not everyone, and then delivers them, and not everyone goes and gets their own supplies. What kind of cleaning protocols are you going to have? Who's going to be in charge of those cleaning protocols? How you're going to place safety items such as hand sanitizer, and whether you have adequate disposal for the safety items that you have elected to use. Also, you're going to be cleaning a lot more. So look at your unused furniture, and do you want to get rid of it? Do you want to, put it away for a while? Would you like to have people remove knickknacks so that you're not cleaning those every day? So really down to a granular level about how's our life going to be now that we have to clean everything every day. This next one, some people will be happy about, some people will be very sad about, but there can no longer be open grazing, no buffets, and you've got to get rid of the candy bowls. We just can't have it. And then finally, involve your landlord and the other interested parties. So your vendors, talk to them, that sort of thing. Next one. And then physical space, like I said, is going to dictate to some degree people. And people is not only your employees, it's your vendors and your customers. I know a lot of people aren't bringing their vendors back immediately, so they're staggering vendors, they're staggering customers to certain areas, or they're changing customer access to their physical space. Decide how you're going to bring people back. Who's going to come back? Are you going to volunteer groups? Are you going to stagger based on job duties, on guidance, business concerns? Are you an essential business? That sort of thing. You want to take discrimination concerns seriously here. So when you're deciding who comes back, make sure that you are not inadvertently discriminating against any protected classes here. The guidance from certain state governments may make this a little bit more tricky to navigate. I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. When you bring people back and what's going to dictate it? Is it job duty function, guidance, installation of safety measures once you can roll it out through your physical space? Next one. How? You can look at staggered schedules, different hours, have a rolling class of people come in. You could have weeks on, weeks off. There's some industries that we're seeing have people housed for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, still while we're at kind of this critical level. And then what are you going to require of your employees? Will you require testing, notification of exposure, what kind of safety gear you're going to have? And both of those will require training. This is a new deal. You need to know that people need to hear this a lot. So I think it's constant training. Training on both the safety gear and then spacing, so people really understand. I think that there's some applications that different people have used in terms of installing on your iPhones. If you're within 6 feet of another, use those. There are lots of tools available. Just decide what is it you're going to use, and then how are you going to manage a positive COVID-19 test? Are you going to quarantine? Are you going to have a doctor's note? You should probably have a policy written out about that. Who are you going to communicate it to? The people that are involved, and that goes beyond employees. How frequently are you going to communicate it? And I really encourage frequent and regular training, particularly at the beginning, because there's going to be a little bit of pushback maybe. People don't really want to change, and these are new rules. People aren't used to doing them. How are you going to do it? Are you going to do it through documentation? So policies, regular written communications, like email reminders. People typically need to hear things about 6 times before it becomes natural to them. Signage, just like when you go into the grocery store now, there's signs telling you this is one way only. If you have rules about areas, put it on a sign and post it. Oral communications are also really important to back these things up. We are recommending, safety huddles or team meetings on a daily basis, team discussions, phone calls, that sort of thing. You also want to include guidance for disciplining non-compliant employees. You want consistency in applications. You need to figure out if one of your senior managers is not going to follow this and one of your lower people, make sure that you apply the same guidelines to both of them. Who are you gonna train? And so I think it bears saying that customers and vendors also need training, just like there's signs in the grocery store and constant announcements about the way the grocery store has changed. You need to communicate that to people who are going to be entering into your space, whether or not they're employees. Daily team meetings and safety huddles. Many of you in industry warehouses already have these, but even in office spaces, I think that these are really good communication tools. They can be over Zoom, and they will have reminders about safety issues that have arisen, reminders on how to take masks on and off, gloves, that sort of thing. And then opportunities for employees to discuss their own experience with this, ask questions, and give feedback. You want to document, as well as everything else, who you have trained, who has received your policies, topics covered in these types of huddles, and then attendance. And that will help you down the road, because we're moving at a very fast pace, establish that you took appropriate measures and employees, and vendors, and customers got the message. So thank you.
Right, thanks, Liz. That was some great information. We're next going to move to Liz Mellon, who's going to talk a little more detail, give us more detail about the OSHA and CDC guidelines.
Thank you, Susan. So when you are considering what kind of plan to create and implement, as Susan has gone through, you want to make sure that you are considering the relevant guidance for your business, which also means the relevant guidance for your industry. The three kind of key areas, first is the Center for Disease Control. The CDC has guidance on social distancing, cleaning standards, among others. There's also the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Most of you know just by its acronym. That has significant and extensive guidance regarding the safety in the workplace. There's also state and local guidance, which is coming out very quickly and in a large volume right now, as many states are getting ready to open back up and also go forward with their imposed social distancing guidelines. So the first step with CDC guidance, I've included the link to just the overall reopening guidelines, guidance that the CDC provides. One of the key suggestions from the CDC is to identify a workplace coordinator that will oversee your COVID-19 plan. So once you create a plan, as Susan suggested, you can have one or perhaps a small team of individuals that will be in charge of administering that plan, tracking the plan, documenting certain things, and following up with employees where needed. You also
Hey, Liz, we're having a little problem with audio on your end. You're buffering just a little bit.
A list of over 300 approved cleaning products that you can use.
So it looks like we've had an audio problem on Liz's end. Sean, do you want to step in and take us through the balance of this slide?
So the CDC, as the slide points out, has a list of over 300 approved cleaning products that came from the EPA. And so that's a resource you can use to make sure that the areas that you're cleaning that you think might have, high traffic areas, or you think that might have exposure to COVID-19, that you're cleaning with the appropriate products that you can point to from, you can point to the EPA or the CDC and say, this was an approved product, this is a product that is effective to clean surfaces exposed to COVID-19. Another key thing to do is to train your employees how to store and use disinfectants. That's going to be something that they have not been doing to date, most likely. And when they come back, they're going to need to know how to do it safely and appropriately. And then other steps that the CDC recommends, obviously, is to increase social distance between employees and customers. You're seeing various stores and grocery stores where they're putting up plexiglass barriers. Those are things to consider. If you have customer and employee interactions, think about ways to essentially create a barrier between the customer and the employee so that each one of them can be safe from sneezes or things like that. Next slide. Okay, so with regard to OSHA, OSHA has guidance that's both general and industry specific. And OSHA, of course, is the federal regulatory agency that requires employers to maintain a safe workplace and that monitors employers to make sure that they do maintain a safe workplace. That is a good recommendation to make sure that you check OSHA's website to make sure that whether there are industry-specific guidelines. And there are many industries that OSHA has issued specific guidelines for that you can find on their website. Some of the general guidelines that apply to all businesses are to follow OSHA standards regarding personal protective equipment and chemicals for cleaning, developing policies and procedures for prompt identification and isolation of sick individuals, which is something that Amy is going to talk a little bit more about, developing and implementing and communicating about workplace protections and flexibilities, meaning, how you can stagger employees when they're working, how you can stagger shifts, how you can stagger floors that employees are working on, some of the things that Susan talked about previously. And also making sure that you implement workplace controls. And I think this goes to part of the plan that Susan was talking about is making sure there's accountability and making sure you have procedures in place so that you have a structure that that you can document and show the efforts that you have been taking to create a safe workplace for your employees. In Montana, there has been a reopening plan that's been issued by the Montana governor on April 22nd. It essentially talks about different phases. Montana is currently in phase 1. Interestingly enough, Montana gives schools the right to choose whether they're going to open or not, which I think is a pretty interesting decision. On May 4th, bars, restaurants, and breweries can reopen for limited service. Employers should have policies and procedures. Again, this goes back to what Susan talked about regarding social distancing and protective equipment for workers, temperature checks and/or symptom screening, which is something that Christina is going to go into more detail about, testing, isolating, and contact tracing in collaboration with public health authorities. That's something that Amy is going to give us a little bit more information about, sanitation, and use and disinfection of common and high traffic areas. So those are all part of the guidelines that Montana's governor has put forward for businesses in Montana to open. Montana is also encouraging teleworking and implementing staggered and alternative shift scheduling. The thing that's interesting about what the Montana order is doing is similar to what we think that the Utah governor is going to do as well, and that is from moving from red to orange. It's not a situation where, okay, we've moved from red to orange, business back to normal. There's a number of restrictions that the governor of Utah has outlined, even in the orange phase, regarding businesses reopening. So those are some of the guidelines and some of the things we recommend that employers look to when creating a plan for return to work. It is imperative that you look at the CDC guidelines, the OSHA guidelines, you look at the state website and the local health authority websites to make sure that you are following those guidelines. And that's critical to maintaining a safe workplace and critical to minimizing your risk in case one of your employees or a customer gets infected with COVID-19 after you reopen. All right, we're now going to have Mark Wagner talk about personal protective equipment.
Well, thank you, Sean. Here, the focus is going to be primarily on face coverings. I mean, after all, the COVID-19 disease is transmitted by droplets that either are suspended in the air or that can, of course, get on a surface, ultimately make it into the body, generally through mucous membranes, which are vulnerable for the transmission, and ultimately progressing into the lungs, and worst case scenario, resulting in or causing severe acute respiratory symptoms and distress. It's a it's a SARS virus by its very nature. So again, we're talking about primarily the types of things that we're seeing in stores, that we're seeing outside as people, in some instances, in some areas, walk their dogs, but particularly in work sites, something to help protect against that. OSHA, which is the primary, at least workplace safety arbiter in the United States, divides face coverings into two categories. The first of these is PPE, or personal protective equipment, and that's what OSHA classifies any sort of loose-fitting masks that aren't actually intended to filter air as PPE, which I'll just refer to as PPE. Surgical masks, dust masks, technically even things like homemade masks or bandanas. Again, these things, when I say loose fitting, if you look at the picture there, you can see there's a gap on the side of the cheeks. There are gaps most likely right around the bridge of the nose. These things are actually, in this instance, going to be more effective against spreading of the disease if the infected person is wearing them than otherwise than preventing acquiring it. But with the most current guidance is, hey, it's still better than nothing. Now, a difference, this first category of face coverings, PPE, is subject to OSHA's PPE standard. And the standard is triggered, it kicks in when PPE, like face coverings in this context, it dictates that it shall be provided and, of course, maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition when it's necessary to protect an employee from environmental hazards that are capable of being encountered in the workplace, are capable of causing the employee injury or impairment through things like inhalation. And the emphasis for the moment in this standard is on the word necessary, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Importantly, under this standard, an employer is responsible for assuring the adequacy, proper maintenance, and sanitation of PPE, even if it happens to be owned by the employee. And going to the next slide, yes, thank you. In addition, OSHA's PPE standard requires employers to perform a basic hazard assessment to essentially evaluate the surroundings and determine what type of hazards might be encountered and what type of things like PPE, in this case, the loose-fitting masks, or as we'll talk about in a minute, respirators, what if those are required, and explaining what they are, why, what rationale was used, and it needs to be in writing. It has to be certified by the person who's conducting it. Some of the things that employers also are required to do is to consider alternative options to protect employees, like the plastic barriers we're seeing in many stores, to identify and then provide appropriate PPE for employees, and to train employees in their proper use of those things and the care of them, to also clean and repair and discard of PPE as needed, and then to create a plan that's periodically reviewed, a little bit of a living document, as we've talked about in the general plan. So now we come to respirators, which are the other category as far as OSHA is concerned. Now, these are face coverings that filter the air, and they're designed to facilitate that. They're close fitted to the user's face without any gaps. Usually they, the more simple kind anyway, comes with fairly tight elastic or tightenable elastic straps. They oftentimes will have foam around various edges, like around the bridge of the nose. And as you see on this picture here, oftentimes will come with a flexible, a moldable metal strip in one or more places where you can actually form it down around your nose and to eliminate gaps. And with the end result being, you can see how tight that looks in there as properly fitted, but you test the fit by pushing on the mask and blowing out. And when you blow out, you're creating positive air pressure. You should feel none of it coming out of any gaps around your face. Same when you're inhaling and creating negative air pressure, air, potentially contaminated air isn't coming in from a gap. It's filtering through this material. And these, the respirators, filtering, there are several filtering standards. An example are the N95 masks. That's what's actually pictured here. That's certified by NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety Health Administration standards, as to filter out 95% or more of particulate matter at a 3 nanometer or so level or above. There are also higher grades, N99, which has a 99% filtration level, N100, that's 99.97, all the way to powered air purifiers, the stuff you see in movies and people in hazmat suits with, you know, the self-contained breathing apparatus type of gear, et cetera. These respirators, when we're talking about those, they're subject both to the OSHA's PPE standard we just discussed and to a more rigorous standard, OSHA's respiratory protection standard. You know, under the latter, respirators are required and shall be provided when they're necessary to protect the health of employees from occupational diseases, primarily caused by breathing contaminated air. The former one that we talked about with PPE, it was hazards to, you know, injury to someone, but this is designed specifically in these areas towards occupational diseases. Some of the things that need to be done under this standard is that the employers have to establish and maintain a respiratory protection program. And again, this is in addition to the other requirements we just discussed. That has to be in writing. It has to include any worksite specific procedures or elements that something dictated by a particular worksite's circumstances or conditions. It has to be administered by someone who's suitably trained, and it has to have a number of elements, including procedures for selecting the right types of respirators. You have to actually do some medical evaluation of employees to make sure that they can wear and use these things effectively, get enough airflow, et cetera. There are fit testing procedures to make sure that they tightly fit properly. You have to have written procedures for the proper use of the respirators in both routine and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. You have to have procedures and schedules for cleaning, disinfecting, storing, you know, maintaining, discarding, et cetera, respirators. You need to train employees about the hazards they're going to face, again, both in routine operations and in reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. You have to train them in their proper use. They're no good if they aren't fitted properly each and every time, or if someone touches the outside of one and then touches their eyes, or touches the outside of one and say when they're removing it and then puts their finger, as they're putting it down, puts their fingers on the inside of the mask and then reuses the mask later on. Now it's contaminated inside. If it was on the outside, it is on the inside, and the employee is not going to benefit from that. And then again, procedures for regularly evaluating the effectiveness of the program. So now we get to the issue of whether the use of face masks in your situation is voluntary or required, and as you'll see, it makes a difference. As to personal protective equipment, PPE, if its use is voluntary in a business, in a situation, then there aren't any additional requirements, even if the employer pays for or provides the masks or the loose-fitting face coverings. However, employers should make it very clear this is what category you're in, that this is, and preferably in writing, so that it again can be documented that the masks are not required and that wearing one is voluntary. Now, if PPE is required, then and the employer must meet the requirements that we discussed, the very first set of requirements we discussed for using PPE under OSHA's standard. As to respirators, if they're voluntary, then the employer, since they're voluntary, needs to meet only there's a section of the OSHA respiratory protection standard, which is much less stringent, which is the voluntary use requirements portion. And basically, you just want to make sure that wearing the masks themselves doesn't introduce itself a new hazard. For example, because of straps and people working around worrying machinery that it could get caught on or snagged in, and something like that, or in an environment where you've already got very low oxygen content or something like that. You got to provide your employees with some basic information in a type of format that's explained in the standard, and then you have to make sure that the face coverings that are used are clean and in good repair. If respirators are required, then you have to meet that both sets of OSHA standards we've just discussed, which again are fairly rigorous. Some industries are very used to those, some are not. There have been, next slide, there's some temporary relaxation of the standards in a couple of areas by OSHA. The fit testing requirements that are fit under the respiratory standards, they're fairly onerous and stringent in what they require, and they can also result, part of it is the actual destructive testing of masks, which you don't really want to do when you're in short supply of them. And to that same kind of point, the second area is a lot of these types of masks are intended for one-time use, ideally. Best case scenario, you've got lots of them, they cost less than $1 each. Use them once, throw them away, replace it with a new one, no cross-contamination. But again, we're in a short supply situation, and there are some relaxation on being able to use them beyond what the manufacturers recommend. Now, and then next slide, of course, this all gets to, well, do you determine whether to require or permit face coverings, and if so, what kind? To some extent, and what I said earlier, the focus on PPE and respirators in their various contexts, so whether they are required or necessary to prevent or protect an employee against airborne contaminants. And in a healthcare situation especially where healthcare workers are going to come into contact with people who have COVID-19, then you're talking respirators, and they should be required. They certainly should be allowed, obviously. Now, when things get much more gray, when you get into general industry, in this context, really meaning non-healthcare, and what we've heard over and over again, especially initially, is that personal protective equipment and respirators are really the least effective protection because they're so subject to user error and potential risks involved just because of overconfidence and then user error. So, there are better measures, more effective measures that include things like eliminating the hazard in the first place to the extent you can, like by telework, engineering controls like better ventilation, administrative controls, better training, signage, social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. That said, and as we're hearing now, with more and more directives, voluntary PPE or respirators should be considered. And I say voluntary at least in the non-healthcare setting, but if you do make a decision to require them, and there may be legitimate reasons and context to do that, where even outside of the healthcare context, you just need to know you're going to subject yourself to these standards to make sure that they're done properly. And that can be overcome, but you may need some guidance if you're not familiar with those.
Hey, Mark, it's Jason. Sorry to interrupt. We've got about 1 minute left for your segment.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I've got about 1 minute left. So some general caveats. You have to look at your state-specific requirements. There are some states and some local jurisdictions that impose very specific requirements. Utah right now, in its phased, reopening type of guidelines, has very little about masks. It certainly doesn't require general industry employers to provide them or be subject to them. But again, it's what you should be doing is you should also be checking, and regularly as they evolve, general industry guidelines, best practices, et cetera. The last point is you might need to give some leeway for ADA accommodation issues or religious accommodations in certain circumstances, religious garb, et cetera. If you have questions about that, then contact any of us and we can guide you through that a little more. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. We're now going to have Christina Jepson talk to us about temperature testing and other types of screening measures that employers can undertake before bringing employees back to work.
Thank you, Sean. Screening for COVID-19 is one of the most important things an employer can do. And it really includes 3 major steps. First of all, considering taking temperatures to see if someone has a fever. And as you probably know, a lot of countries and different areas have done well with some temperature screening to at least catch a good amount of this. Second of all is asking about symptoms, finding out if people have symptoms, and then finally asking if people have had potential exposure. So when we talk about screening for COVID-19, it's kind of interesting because I've been practicing in employment law for almost 25 years, and it's very rare that I would say, do medical testing at work or ask people about symptoms. I mean, there are some circumstances where you do it, but it's pretty unusual. But obviously we're in an unusual time, and the CDC recommends screening at least to some degree. So you should think about screening. And really all the relevant organizations that we've talked about, the CDC, the federal government, state governments, are all saying that employees with symptoms of COVID-19 should not come into the workplace, for obvious reasons, because they can expose other employees, they can expose customers. And so we have to use the tools that we have to try to figure out if people have symptoms or if they potentially have COVID-19. Now, the CDC does make a big point of making it clear that just because you don't have a fever, you don't have symptoms, you don't know about exposure, doesn't mean you don't have COVID-19. You still could have it. You could be asymptomatic, and you could be, completely unaware of the exposure. But at least by, covering those 3 areas, we're going to catch a lot of people who potentially have it. So when we're talking about taking temperatures and screening for symptoms, a couple things you should keep in mind. First of all is that you need to keep a log. You should either log all the temperatures that you take or at least log those that are above the threshold that you end up setting for your company. You should also log whether anyone has COVID-19 symptoms and whether they answer yes that they've had exposure. And it's critical that this information is kept confidential. Just like any other medical information you collect in the workplace, it has to be kept in a separate file, and it should only be shared with people on a need-to-know basis. So this is going to be, with some select people in management, and then if you get to a point where someone is positive and you need to let others in the workplace know that they were potentially exposed, you're still going to protect the person who had it by not disclosing their name, not disclosing other information about them, just what is absolutely necessary. Next slide. Now, if you do decide to take temperatures, you need to start out by having a policy and setting a criteria. And the CDC says that anyone with a 100.4 temperature or above has a fever, but you might choose to make it a little bit lower than that. I've seen employers do everything from 100 up, which you can certainly do, but you need to make it clear that once you do set a cutoff that it's applied consistently. So anyone who has that temperature should not come into the workplace until they're cleared. Next slide. So if you're going to have a policy where you check for temperatures, or even if you don't, you should probably have a policy where you screen for symptoms. If people are going to be coming in contact with each other at work or coming in contact with customers or vendors, screening for symptoms is a really important part of making sure that your workplace is safe. Now, when we talk about symptoms, it's really important that you stay informed and you check on a regular basis what the symptoms are, because I'm sure most of you are aware that when this first became an issue in this country, the only two symptoms that were really on the radar were a cough and shortness of breath. And then fever was, eventually sort of thrown into the mix. And just recently, the CDC added more symptoms. And if you look at other health guidelines, there's other symptoms that, they also look at. So it's important that you kind of set forth what you're going to be asking employees about so they know, and that you stay on top of that. So at least for now, the CDC says that someone should, be considered symptomatic if they have a cough or they have a shortness of breath or difficulty breathing. In addition, if they have at least two of these other symptoms, they should also be considered potentially COVID-19 positive. So fever, chills, shaking, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, a new loss of taste or smell. And again, if anyone has positive symptoms, they should not come into the workplace until they've been cleared. And then finally, something else you can ask about is exposure. And that is whether someone's had close contact with someone who's tested positive in the last 2 weeks. If they've tested positive, and again, they shouldn't come into work if either of those things are the case. If they travel to a high-risk area, which you shouldn't be having business travel right now unless it's absolutely essential. But if someone does do that, they should also self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, if you're going to have temperature testing, you have to think about how are you going to do this. And you've got to think about it in advance and have procedures in place. There's a couple of options. One is just to have people test at home and self-report their temperatures, or you can have them do it in the workplace. Now, obviously, if they do it at home, you don't have control over that process, and there's more trust involved with that. If they do it in the workplace, you can be more certain that you're getting an accurate result, but then you have to basically administer that program, so it can be more difficult. Now, if employees take their temperatures at home, you still want to do some basic training on how they should do it. And you want to make sure that people have access to thermometers. And for example, when this sort of all hit a couple of months ago, I ordered a thermometer on Amazon, and 2 months later, it still has not arrived. So not everyone has them. And I've checked all the ones in our home, and none of them seem to be working. So, that's something you have to think about. People have thermometers. Can you get them to them if they don't? And any other equipment that you're going to need for screening, start thinking about immediately, because you've got to get that order to make sure you can get it. If you're going to use apps for people to report their symptoms or temperatures, you should, start looking into those. If they're going to have computers to answer a survey, then, you need to make sure everyone has the equipment they need. Something you can consider in terms of people taking their temperatures at home is you could require them to take a photo of the reading and send it. You could have them do it over Zoom or FaceTime. So it's kind of a hybrid between them doing it at home and yet you having some interaction with it. Those are possibilities. If you're going to take temperatures at work, and we've probably all seen this to some degree, I took my child in for an orthodontist appointment this week, and they took our temperatures when we walked in. So this is something that's going on quite a bit. But if you're going to do it at work, you have to determine who is going to do the temperature taking. You could have the employees do it themselves at work. They could come to work, use your thermometers, and before they enter the building or right as they enter, they can take their own temperatures. You could have another employee designated as the person who does it. It's helpful if that person's had some medical training. There are places you can hire to come on site and do it, sort of med nurse kind of places, or you're going to have to train someone basically to do that. There is a recommendation from OSHA that if you have someone take other people's temperatures, that they be provided PPE, because there's a risk that they're going to be exposed. You can't be feet away and take someone's temperature, even if it's a head scanner. You have to be closer than that, so they need to be provided with that sort of protection. And like I mentioned already, if you're going to do this, you're going to have thermometers. Start early, get them, get the supplies for cleaning them, get your masks and other face coverings early. If you're going to have lanes, you need to think about cones. You need to really think about all the supplies you're going to need very, very quickly. It's preferable, obviously, that you have a contact-free thermometer, a head scanner, if you can get a hold of those. Other things to keep in mind with temperature checking is you still have to maintain social distancing with people who are lining up to have their test taken, not the person taking the temperature. Minimize crowds, clean the equipment between every use, clean high-touch areas, look at any industry guidelines that there are in your industry about this process. Some of the options for doing temperature taking at work could be do it outside of the workplace before they ever enter. That's the CDC's preference. You could do drive-through screening. That's where you might need traffic control equipment. You could set up a trailer or other temporary structure. I mean, obviously, this all depends on the size of your workplace and how much you need to do. You can have people come inside the facility, but if you do that, you want to have their temperature taken as soon as they come in, before they, potentially contaminate other people. So again, a lot of things you might have to procure. If someone doesn't pass either the temperature screening or questions about symptoms, then they should not be allowed to return to work until they're cleared. You need to have written procedures about when someone will be excluded, when they can return to work, and whether remote work will be available until they're cleared. You need to follow up with people if they're sent home, find out if they were tested, if they got medical advice. You need to determine whether you need to notify other individuals that they were potentially exposed. So for example, if they worked on an assembly line with other employees, everyone on their line would probably need to be notified. And then you definitely have to have return to work procedures. I've included in a slide the basic guidelines about when someone can return to work after they've screened out potentially having COVID-19. So you can see why it's important to have these written in advance. Now, once you've decided on a plan or procedure, just like Susan mentioned, it's really important that you have a written policy, that you choose a facilitator to run the program, you communicate to employees, you have signage, and do a dry run. You can see that there's a lot of things that could potentially go wrong, equipment you could not think about, so it's important to do that. Now, other issues you need to think about is one, on labor law, you have to compensate people for the time that is involved in the screening or temperature taking. So you need to make sure that that's built in some way you're going to compensate them. And you also got to figure out what you're going to do if someone refuses to be tested or refuses to provide answers. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Christina. We're now going to move to Amy, and I hate to do this to you, Amy, but can you maybe give a quick 5-minute highlight of the testing, isolating, and contact tracing, and then if you're able and willing, for folks that want to stay after the allotted time, maybe you can go into a little bit more detail. Is that something you might be able to do?
Sure.
Thank you.
So on testing, this is what we can request that our employees do in order to come into work that's a little bit more invasive than a thermal scan, which is the temperature testing. I have the EEOC guidance up here, which was just issued last Thursday, April 23rd. They are now saying that an individual with the virus will pose a direct threat to others. So that is where the testing comes from. This will apply to temperature tests and also what are called PCR tests, which is the nasal swab. This arguably may not apply to antibody testing, which is a more invasive blood draw. The EEOC may next talk about antibody testing, but we don't have that yet. testing considerations is the next slide. If you're going to test to see if someone has COVID-19 before they return to work, what you need to know is that the EEOC said employers should ensure that tests are accurate and reliable. This is a pretty heavy burden, but you can generally rely on the FDA, the CDC, and certainly your local health district. Remember that you might get false positives, false negatives, and that any test is just a snapshot for one employee at one time. And of course, you need to compensate your employees. Practical advice is you might want to work with perhaps a private lab for arranging for testing if you want to do this. Communicate to your employees how and when they should do this. So when an employee tests positive, there are a great deal of things that could be an entire presentation. But these are from an employee standpoint. Be human, understand what they're going through when someone comes to you and says that they have a positive test result. Follow all the basic CDC guidelines, which is send the employee home for 14 days and make sure they know that you won't reveal their identity. You will cooperate with local officials unless you are a nursing home. You don't have an independent duty to report this yourself, but you probably will get information from the employee. But as of April 9th, you can disclose the identity to a public health entity. Then, if you are a business, next slide, I think. Once you have the positive test results, all of the things you need to look at for your continuity planning are, do we need to close in order to accomplish the cleaning that the CDC says we need to do? Are we already working remotely, and have we done all of these things? And this is when all of the things will become very clear on why you should have done them all. When you're going about tracing where this one employee or multiple employees or could have been around your office. So, you know, does everyone have to go home at once, depending on who this individual is, or do certain people go home? One thing that people may not think about, and applies more to those in the public health or emergency sector, is what if you have employees who have an immunocompromised person at home, and what you can do when giving information. You may hear that they feel like they can't go home, and you might need a plan in place for that. Then when an employee tests positive, there are all the legal things, and this is legal/HR that you may already have considered and may already be doing. Check your state workers' compensation law. It may not, or likely is probably not covered by workers' comp, but check to be sure. Notify your compensation carrier if it seems like it was a work incident. Record it on your OSHA log, and then now you go down the road of checking the leave benefits, your short-term disability policy. The testing, isolating, and the contact tracing, this is something that is done also by local health departments, and but depending on your local health department and how busy they are, you may not want to leave it all for them, and you as well will have a duty to keep your workplace safe. So you want to, after perhaps the first conversation with the employee, and hopefully you've told all your employees this is how it's going to be, so they're aware of it. then go to them later and maybe in the next conversation say, do you have, where have you been in the office? Who have you had close contact with? And close contact is defined as been within 6 feet of them for 10 minutes. And then the established a timeline line should say for when employees return. If they are positive, you should get a medical clearance. And then we talk a lot about communication. Certainly communication to employees who have been exposed is important, and also to your employees in advance of doing this so they know what to expect. If you have a positive, rumors will circulate pretty quickly. So you should execute your contract tracing plan. Have you been tracking people and where they're going? Did you close your kitchen or, you know, reduce your, not have your meeting? And then I was to talk about the state of Idaho and the reopening plan. So the governor of Idaho has said, and I think this is true for all employers, that the path back starts with employee confidence and consumer confidence in our organizations and our businesses. So this is where employers have a role to play and to help make things predictable and transparent so that everyone feels confident in going back to the extent they do go back initially. Idaho has advised that the plans should be, if you're able to, make them public for more transparency, but I don't believe they need to be approved by any government entity. And then the governor's guidelines have a 4-stage plan. Tomorrow we find out, but it looks like we will be at stage 1 by May 1st. And all of the things are as expected, basically. You can reopen if you can maintain the physical distancing. Don't keep doing business travel. And Idaho is actually opening places of worship, daycares, and organized youth activities subject to particular guidance that was also posted today.
Okay, thanks, Amy. We really appreciate it. For all of our participants on the webinar today, feel free to leave. We want to be respectful of your time. We have a few questions come in that if the presenters are willing to stick around, and anyone who wants to stick around as a participant, please feel free to do so. But if you need to go, we certainly understand, and thank you for participating. But there's a couple of questions that came in that I wanted to ask the presenters. First question is for Amy. If you're going to do temperature testing or you're going to do COVID-19 testing of an employee, are there any HIPAA concerns or regulations that employers need to be aware of?
Do you mean Christina?
Oh, well, either Christina or Amy. Yeah, either one of you.
So an employer is and an employee, HIPAA does not apply to an employer-employee relationship. It's just not applicable. That being said, you still have a lot of confidentiality requirements. So it doesn't really matter that HIPAA doesn't apply. You should still be confidential. You still have to keep files separate, that sort of thing.
I believe it applies, HIPAA applies if you are self-insured, if you're a large enough employer and are self-insured. And then, yeah, it's mostly ADA and privacy considerations.
Yeah.
But those have been relaxed. The EEOC has said that they don't want the ADA to interfere with CDC guidance.
And what about, and this is for anyone on anyone in the group, what if an employee just simply doesn't want to come back to work because they don't feel safe? They say, look, I understand that you're reopening. I don't feel safe coming back to work. I don't want to come back to work. What should an employer do then?
It's in one of my slides in this next area about vulnerable persons, but basically, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't immediately say you're fired because you're not coming back to work. You want to have a conversation with that person, try to find out why they don't want to come back to work. Keep your ears open for the potential that they're raising an ADA covered event. So if they say it's really because I don't want to come back to work because I have a heart condition and I'm scared if I get this that I'm going to, really be in trouble, then you have an ADA issue that you need to talk to them about. So, but if it really comes down to it and they have no ADA issue, they have no reason not to come to work, you really need them, or you have to be consistent, and you may consider taking disciplinary action.
Okay, great. So Christina, it looks like you have some information for those who are still on the call. I think we have a hard stop at 4:45. You want to go through that information you have regarding protecting vulnerable persons?
Sure. In terms of protecting vulnerable persons, we're talking about people over 60 and people with underlying health conditions. And again, this is an area that changes a lot, so you need to stay informed about it. But, we really are in a little bit of a gray area here. On the one hand, we're having, a lot of CDC, federal government, state government saying, please try to accommodate these people. Please try to make sure that they're okay. And yet we have the ADA on the other side of that, saying you shouldn't be asking people about these issues unless they volunteer. So you have to be careful. If you go forward on the slides, really, I guess the bottom line advice is similar to the last question. You should try to accommodate people if you can. You should let them bring it up if possible, or you could have communicate to your workforce that it's okay for them to come to you if they have a request for an accommodation, but you really shouldn't be going to people and asking them if they have underlying health conditions, because you're getting into, ADA prohibited conduct there. So it's, being very receptive to it, maybe even encouraging it, and yet not directly asking about it. Now, the EEOC does let you have like if you're having a volunteer program for employees to come back to work, you can have a questionnaire where you ask them a series of questions. Do you have a health condition? Do you have someone at home with a health condition? Do you have child care issues? And not have them say yes to those individual questions, but just indicate with all the questions that they have a concern where they don't want to volunteer to come back to work. So that is one possibility. You can go ahead and go forward. And, one of the concerns is you just can't automatically say that no one over 60 can't come back to work, or no one who's pregnant, or anyone with a health condition, because then you're potentially discriminating. So you have to be more nuanced than that. But, be flexible, allow teleworking if you can. If you're considering a volunteer program, there is a safe way to do that without getting into questions that are problematic. Let employees know that they can come forward with a request for accommodation, and you will try to accommodate them if you can. And then also keep in mind that they're they potentially qualify for sick leave under the Response Act. And you might even encourage employees, if they have an underlying condition, to get a note from their doctor so that they can qualify for the sick leave. And because a lot of that is covered by taxes, tax relief anyway. So it's a good idea to let people take advantage of that if they can. And you can just include the rest of the slides, but that pretty much is the bottom line on that, Sean.
All right, great. Thanks, Christina, and thanks everyone for participating on our webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us. We are here to help. We have prepared policies to advise employers about returning these issues that we've talked about and bringing their workforce back. And we'd love to hear from you. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.